Hello again. I'm David Pendergrass, the pastor of discipleship here at First Methodist West Chase. Glad you're watching the video. Last week, your DGroup talked about reading the epistles, the letters, in historical and literary context, and how the letters are as authoritative as if the person was there in the flesh, and also how they followed similar conventions to the ancient world, but also, and maybe most importantly, that they're written to address, most of them are written to address specific pastoral issues in a particular church or region of churches. And that's why historical and literary context matters so much. So when Paul's writing to the church at Corinth, we want to know where was Corinth, and what was going on in Corinth, and why would he talk about speaking in tongues, the people in Corinth, and what women prophesying and so forth. Historical context really helps us understand why he would have said such a thing, and why the Spirit would have inspired him to say such a thing to those people in that time. Now, this week we're going to talk about what is really popular, and it should be. It's what Christians, why we're doing this whole study, in fact, and that is learning how to interpret and apply correctly the Bible. That's what makes us grow as disciples and mature. Of course, like I said a long time ago, several weeks ago, of course you can just have you and your Bible and any decent English translation and get the gist of the gospel. Of course you can. But that's like saying, can you learn the basics of English grammar and alphabet by having a basic English grammar and you're 8 years old? Well, 6 years old, sure you can. But if you want to grow and mature at all, we start learning more about what was going on back then. We can start learning more responsible ways to apply the Bible. And that's what this is all about. These are tools to help us interpret better and be more mature in our understanding, more wise in our understanding of the Bible. And secondly, it helps us be more mature and more wise on how to apply the biblical text so that we live as disciples of Jesus even better than we did the day before. This week I want to talk about some principles. Some of these things we've covered already for different genres, but I'm going to talk about it today the most because the letters in the New Testament are such a seed bed. They are one of the favorite spots for people to go to apply something Paul said or James or whomever or John or whatever to us today. Now, every Christian chooses to apply or not to apply a text to us. Every Christian does it. Like every Christian interprets. It's either a convincing or a good interpretation, or it's a bad one. It's an ill-informed one. Well, the same way about application. We all do it, and we all choose which text to apply. And this is where, of course, almost every single church split and every single controversy comes from. It's how to apply a biblical text. Now, there are many texts that are never, ever, as far as I know, in any literature I've ever read, apply to us today. For example, in 2 Timothy 4:9 and 11, 13, and 19, when Paul is talking to Timothy, when you come to Troas, bring my cloak with you. I've never heard a sermon or read a book where a pastor says, and we too need to go find Paul's cloak and go to Troas. We've got to find people's cloaks and help them out. And right, I haven't heard that before. You might have, I haven't. These are most just common sense things. They don't really cause controversy. We go, that was the ancient world. Ancient world. All right, ancient world. We don't have to apply that. Then there are many other texts that they're applied or not applied depending on a person's societal or theological culture. That's where things get real heated. And then people start throwing out terms like it clearly means or the plain meaning of the text, which of course couldn't be farther from the truth. If it were so clear and so plain, you wouldn't have millions of Christians disagreeing on these issues. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11:6, and I'm going to look up just a couple of these references because we have the time. In 1 Corinthians 11:6 and 7, Paul, speaking to the church at Corinth around the year AD 52, says, if a woman will not veil herself, and of course the assumption is some are not in the church at Corinth, if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her wear a veil. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Now, do you apply that now or not? If you're a woman, I help your D group ask them that. Do you apply that? Now, the question is, let's say on the middle of page 53, and I really hope your D group will talk about this. And so don't give them the answer yet, okay? I want you to ask them exactly why or why not. Can you articulate for me, and I mean this kindly, I don't mean, tell me now, all right? Can you, if they say, well, no, I don't care, I don't have to cover my head up, I'm going to say, wonderful. Can you tell me why not? What went in your mind, what filter did it had to pass through for you to say, I'm going along, that verse does not apply to me. Well, this one does apply to me. How did you know to change directions? Now, in my experience, whatever this is worth, in my experience, most people I've met cannot at all articulate why. Outside of the real common sense ones, like I've already mentioned in 2 Timothy. Most people don't know why. Most people might say, that's the way I've always been taught, or that's the way my pastor said to, or that's the way my church tradition has always done it. And those are viable reasons. All we're trying to do now is get your D group to think about, wow, I really do apply certain texts and not other texts, and I need to think about why I choose the way I do. So we bring awareness. I hope you look up these references. Another tip, have different people pick verses, right? You don't all have to open it to 1 Corinthians 11:6 and everybody to 1 Corinthians 14 and everybody to 1 Peter. People can pick and choose if they want to. And the reason why that's really important is if a person's fast at finding references, they know their Bible well, that's great. But if they don't know it well, it's very embarrassing for them, for a lot of them, to sit around and have to find while everyone's sitting there waiting. We don't want to create that environment. So it's always safe to say, who wants to pick this verse, or whatever. And if you're a speed finder, then you can just go look up every one of them, whatever. It gives people time. And always encourage people to use the table of contents. Remember what I said the very first week in the preface. This is a safe place to be ignorant. It's okay. It's okay. Tell your people, look at your table of contents. You have time. Don't be afraid to use that. You don't have to know what every book of the Bible is yet. As you mature, you start memorizing them, and you have to work on that. But right now, take your time. No harm, no shame, no foul. But look these references up. This is going to help you a lot to think about why we apply. Now, here are some basic rules. This originally was chapter 4 in the book. So early on, he covers these rules. I've been hinting at these rules and saying these rules all along the way. But let me say it one more time. Now, please, D group leader, if you're watching this, if you're watching this now and you're a D group leader, please be sure to go over this very carefully in your D group. Even if you've covered this already, even if you've been saying this a lot, because this is so worth repeating. Okay, so these are basic rules for proper interpretation and application, exegesis and hermeneutics. Now, before I even go over them, you might be saying, David, why? What makes you the standard? And the answer is, I'm not the standard. I didn't make these up. Quite frankly, these are easily, well, one of them I added from the book, but what they present here in these basic rules, these are by far the consensus amongst almost every New Testament Bible scholar there is, and all through the early church fathers, Tertullian, Origen, Augustine. These are the same kinds of things they could do. The ancient world, they had a few more, they were a little slipperier on the rules, as it were, but almost every modern Christian biblical scholar would say these are a good way to use it responsibly. So if you don't find these compelling, if someone in your D group says, I don't have to read it that way, the Spirit tells me everything I need to know, you say, okay, but I would disagree with that kind of reading. I would discourage that kind of reading. So here's what, again, is a strong consensus, and I certainly very much believe in these kind of typical rules or parameters. Number one, determine what the text meant to the ancient audience. So you do the exegetical work. That you ask, what did it mean back then? Where was that city? Who was that person? What did that concept mean back then? What did that practice mean back then? You try your best to be a time traveler. In fact, that's the whole reason I got a PhD, was I wanted to think like an ancient person. If you do not do this, again, this is what I tell people, please tell your group, if we don't do this, the sky's the limit. You can apply it any way you want to. And that's not what we want, not in orthodoxy. The text cannot mean to us what it never could have meant to them. So we don't want to have a willy-nilly, and most D-group, small group, Sunday school classes, all through my life I've been a part of, are much more akin to a radio call-in show where there's no specialist. It's just everyone calls in, and everyone's opinion in the call-in is equally authoritative. I think OJ did it. Next call. Thank you, caller. I think he didn't do it. Next caller. I don't like football players. Thank you. Next caller. Everyone has an equal opinion. Well, when it comes to Christianity, of course, that's not true because we could misinterpret and misapply. And the only way to not being a thank you, sir, next caller is by saying, okay, let's put some parameters up here. If it didn't mean that to them and they're the inspired authors, then it can't mean that to us. So that's why that's really important. Secondly, after we determine what it meant to them, whenever we share the exact same life situation, we can directly apply a commandment or principle to us. When we share the exact same life situation, and there's so many. For example, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Well, all there in context, all sometimes can mean all Jews, all Gentiles, all in the city. And the context of Romans, in Romans 3, if we had time, I would unpack all that, but you can read it yourself. In the context of Romans 3, Paul means all humans. What he means is all Jews and Gentiles, but that's all humans. All Jews and Gentiles have sinned. Well, that's applicable to me because I'm a Gentile. When Jesus tells people, if any one of you, to his audience, who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple, Jesus says. And there, of course, he means let go of it in your discipleship to me. And so for some people, they had to literally sell everything they had. Others still did not have to sell everything they had. They just renounced its hold and its control over their lives. So if we have the exact same life situation, boom, connect the dots. Connect the dots to your heart's desire. Third, if the life situation is not exactly the same, and that's most of the Bible, because we're 2,000 to 3,500 years removed, then we look for the principle to apply in a similar life situation. In a similar life situation. This is not always black and white, I get it, but for example, Sarah was promised a baby because she was apparently barren. Well, a similar life situation is where a woman can't get pregnant. It's not okay to make a principle out of that and say the principle of it is wherever there's a barren woman, God's going to give you a baby. No, in context, Sarah was promised by God that she would bear a child. The principle there is whatever God promises is going to come to pass. Secondly, if you are a barren woman in the year 2013 and God shows up to you via an angel or a dream and says you will bear a child, then I would say you apply the same text. You've been promised by God. But you're looking for a principle in a similar life situation. Those which you look, and most things fall in category 3, trying to find a similar life situation. Now, of course, that is, and I'm going to stop here, like 3B would be the invisible one would be, or the comment, parenthetical comment would be, many things are just not applicable to us. They're just not. They don't meet these criteria. We don't have the exact same life situation, or even if we do find a principle, our life situation is so different, it's hard to tell. But fourthly, let me say this. Whatever the principle is, it must be something that Jesus would command or do. If what you think God is telling you does not fit perfectly into the life and teachings of Jesus, then you've misheard God, and I have too. So whatever it is, if it's not something Jesus would do, then we've missed something. One tip I might also add, and that's, turn page number 5. If you're not certain, and I've done this several times in my life, research how the church has historically interpreted and applied the text. And what has the church said about this issue? For example, the issue of abortion. Jews have always been opposed to abortion. That is, infanticide, killing a baby afterward by abandonment, or in utero, and early Christians have always been opposed to it. It doesn't mean they never did it, but just if and when it did happen, it was considered very immoral and sad to God. Another issue is homosexuality. If you're confused about what Paul might have meant by this word here and there, it's powerful to me and many, many people that the early church has consistently condemned homoerotic behavior. That it has never been the case in the history of the church until about the 1960s and 70s has the church ever said that homoerotic behavior is even remotely possible to be acceptable to God. That's pretty powerful stuff to me. In almost 2,000 years, the church has had one opinion on something. So if we have any confusion, usually about these other steps, what's the church done? And there will be a pattern somewhere. I'll wrap up quickly on this last couple parts because I know you can read this and there's not a whole lot to add to it. The New Testament does repeat those things that are inherently immoral and moral. Usually it's just obvious. Now, I've included a list of every single vice list I could find. It's every single one. Now, if you read all those, which you won't probably have time in your D group, which is fine, just pick a few of them. They're going to sound strikingly similar. That's on purpose because they were common lists. Common. That is, like sexual immorality, adultery, idolatry, drunkenness, homoerotic behavior, murder, and on and on. These are always immoral. They are consistently immoral in the New Testament and through the early church. So when Christians talk about sin, let's keep those at the center. Let's keep those at the center. On the other hand, all these other issues that people like to, quite frankly, debate a whole lot about women prophesying and celibacy and so forth, there's not one consistent answer, and that's where a lot of research, exegesis, and application comes into play. And finally, we ought to have humility. I say we ought to because Jesus was humble, and the early church valued humility. And that means we should be teachable and open to the fact that we don't know all the answers to the questions we might have for application. 4 big areas where the text just gives different answers. That's a Christian's view of women's ministries in the church. On the one hand, you have text where Paul explicitly denounces teaching that women shouldn't teach. And you have texts like that. On the other hand, you have multiple texts where Paul praises women who were co-workers, co-evangelists, which means they taught the gospel to people. Again, context determines, from my mind, clears a whole lot of that up. That when Paul is prohibiting teaching, it's particular abuses in a particular church and location. But anyway, you can read those texts and others and figure out what your conclusion is. A Christian view of Rome, a Christian view of wealth, and a Christian view of food offered to idols. There are different views on that. Now, this does bother many Christians because many Christians like to have the Bible have one answer on everything, kind of a go-to book. In fact, we like it so much that several respected Christian leaders write books that kind of have a go-to guy. I think Charles Stanley has one. I think Chuck Swindoll and some others that are very popular Christian authors have these books of kind of everything you need to know. If you had a question about this, I need an answer for it. Fortunately and unfortunately, the Bible is not like that. The Bible does not have one answer on every single thing. The reason why it doesn't have one answer on every single thing is because God inspired authors at different times and in different places, writing to different people, locales, different things to say to them in their particular situations. That's how it works. That's how it worked, and that's how it still works today. So these tips will really help you apply the Bible well. And finally, again, to say it one more time, humility is always appropriate. It's always appropriate. It's okay for us Christians to have differing views, and it's certainly okay for us to say, you believe that. What is your evidence for that in the text? And then you go through the filters. What does the text say that? What's the pattern in the literary context? Is this the principle, or is this something a one-to-one ratio, an exact situation? Is this something Jesus would do? Is this something the church has always agreed upon? And if you don't find those criteria, that if the person has an idea that doesn't pass that filter, it's okay for you to say, I hear what you're saying, but I do disagree because I don't find that as compelling as you do. I think rather a better interpretation is, or application is, for these reasons, because it fits the historical context better, the literary context better, and so forth. So it's okay for us to do that and still break bread together and not call names and fights and dissensions and so forth. Instead, I still love you as a brother and sister in Christ. We just have different views of how to apply this text. But I'm so glad you and I are both, you're telling this imaginary person, I'm so glad that you and I both are concerned and serious about how to apply the Bible. That's what makes us brothers and sisters in Christ. We want to be good disciples of Jesus. God bless you. I hope this week is good. I bet it's going to be really good. I bet you're going to have some real good discussion. Next week, we're going to come back and finish up the whole study and talk about that book at the end, Revelation. God bless you. Please let me know if you have any questions or any way I can encourage you. See you next week.